All right, if we could grab our seats. We are a little bit behind, but we've got enough time. We're okay. So let me go ahead and at least go ahead. Let me go ahead and introduce our panel, our final panel for the conference. And I'm going to introduce all three speakers and read their bios now, and then I'll invite them according to the schedule as listed here. Father Reverend Bogdan I can't say your Haldio. Did I say that right? Haldio. Thank you. Is a priest of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Canada under the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and in addition to many years of parish ministry, served as Chancellor of the UOCC from 2005 to 2008. Between 1998 and 2012, he authored hundreds of popular articles in the church newspaper, The Herald, and has served on many diocesan and metropolia boards and committees. He has been very involved in the translation and setting to music of liturgical texts. He is currently a PhD student at the Toronto School of Theology with interests in ecclesiology, orthodoxy in Canada, and interfaith relations. Our second speaker is Father Oliver Herbal, who graduated from St. Louis University with a PhD in historical theology in 2009. He is the author of numerous works, including Turning to Tradition, Converts and the Making of an American Orthodox Church, and more recently, Faith and Justice in War. Father Herbal has served as a chaplain in the United States Air Force, serving the North Dakota Air National Guard since February 2014. His overseas assignments have included Africa and Southwest Asia. He is married to his wife Lori of 26 years, and they have 3 children, Micah, Macrina, and Anastasia. He spends his free time hunting, fishing, and wrenching on classic cars. Very good. And Matthew Namey, who is our third speaker. As you know, we've heard from Matthew already, but briefly, he is the editor of Orthodox History, where he's been blogging about church history for the past 13 years. By day, he's a lawyer working exclusively on Orthodox matters for a nonprofit called Orthodox Ministry Services. He lives in Washington State with his wife and 6 children. We will begin the session with Father Bogdan, who will be speaking to us on the title of From Reticence to Recognition, the role of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese in the reception of the Ukrainian Orthodox Metropolias in the U.S. and Canada by the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Father Bogdan, welcome.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to say that it's an honor to be here. And before beginning, I want to thank the organizers of the conference for this kind invitation and to express my sadness that I can't be there in person, as well as my hope that I'll have the opportunity to visit Holy Cross soon. And if Father Odysseos Drossos is still there, we miss you. I'm going to go to share my screen now. And, where are we? Right there. And share. Okay, got it?
Yes.
Okay. During the 20th century, there were 4 major attempts by the Ukrainian Orthodox Metropolias in Canada and the USA to enter into Eucharistic union with the Ecumenical Patriarchate. This was ultimately realized by the Canadian Church in 1990 and the American Metropolia in 1995. The Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of North and South America was instrumental in facilitating this process. But why did the Ukrainian Metropolias need canonical recognition in the first place? In 1918, the Ukrainian Orthodox churches were founded in the United States and Canada by immigrants without ties to a mother church in Europe. Most of the faithful were former Eastern Rite Catholics who wished to return to their ancestral Orthodox Christian faith. Both churches were formed from the bottom up by laity and priests. From the outset, they identified as belonging to the Ecumenical Communion of Orthodox churches and sought episcopal oversight. Entering the jurisdiction of the Russian mission as a Ukrainian diocese proved impossible due to the Russian mission's anti-Ukrainian bias. The Syrian bishop Germanos Shegedi, one of those vagrant bishops that Father Apostolos mentioned earlier today, accepted episcopal oversight of these Ukrainian dioceses, and then, following the arrival of Archbishop Ioan, or John Theodorovich, from Ukraine in 1924, he transferred canonical jurisdiction over these churches to him. And it's here that the problem begins. The Orthodox Church in Ukraine had been under the jurisdiction of the Ecumenical Patriarchate from the late 10th till the century until 1686, when episcopal oversight was transferred to the Patriarchate of Moscow. During the following centuries, Ukraine, as a colony of the Russian Empire, experienced Russification and oppression. With the fall of the Tsarist regime in 1917, a movement towards Ukrainian church independence began, culminating in the first all-Ukrainian church Sobor, or council, held in October of 1921 in Kyiv, at which the foundation of the Ukrainian autocephalous Orthodox Church was laid. Due to the refusal of any Moscow Patriarchate bishops to attend this council, a radical decision was taken by the council participants to consecrate bishops for this church using the so-called Alexandrian method, that is, by the laying on of hands of presbyters, deacons, and laity without episcopal participation. John Theodorovich, who assumed leadership of the Canadian American churches in 1924, had been consecrated at Sobor, and this quote-unquote self-consecrated identity was a major obstacle to the canonical recognition of him and the churches he led. Archbishop John's anomalous canonical status was used to great effect by the leaders of the Russian and the Greek Catholic, so-called Uniate dioceses in North America, to undermine the legitimacy of the Ukrainian Orthodox bodies, resulting in the formation of a Ukrainian Orthodox Church of America in the late 1920s, a parallel jurisdiction composed of formerly Uniate priests and parishes who wished to return to Orthodoxy, but refused, for canonical reasons, to enter the Theodorovich jurisdictions. This Ukrainian Orthodox Church of America, as opposed to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the USA, led by Theodorovich, was received under the Omophorion of the Greek Archdiocese of North and South America in the early 1930s. Wishing to unite and become metropolitan of these two Ukrainian churches, Theodorovich appealed to the Ecumenical Patriarchate in order to receive confirmation of his canonical legitimacy so that he might become the metropolitan of the United Church. With the assistance of Archbishop Athenagoras, he contacted the Patriarchate in 1931 and again in 1935, outlining his vision for his church's relationship to the Fanar in his letter to Patriarch Photius of March 13, 1935. And you see on the screen the schema that he offers to the Patriarchate. As can be seen from the slide, Theodorovich sought to be received by the Patriarchate as a canonical archbishop and ensure the internal autonomy of his church. The Patriarchate and the Exarch took the position that Archbishop John could only be received as a bishop after having been consecrated in the canonical manner, a step Theodorovich was not willing to take, resulting in the failure of this first attempt to gain canonical recognition. A second attempt at obtaining canonical recognition was made after World War II, when Ukrainian Orthodox bishops who had served in the jurisdiction of the Polish Autocephalous Orthodox Church and had fled from the Soviets formed an episcopal synod in Western Europe, also calling itself the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church, although these bishops were consecrated in the traditional manner and possessed apostolic succession. Most of these bishops either remained in Western Europe or emigrated to North America. The need of the North American metropolias for bishops, in conjunction with the illegitimate canonical status of Archbishop Theodorovich, resulted in a rekindling of the efforts aimed at the canonical recognition of him and his churches. Archbishop John was now being squeezed from two sides. The Ukrainian bishops in Western Europe, as well as the Exarch of the Ecumenical Patriarchate in North America, were demanding that he agree to consecration as a precondition for entering into Eucharistic communion. While the Archbishop was willing to proceed, the Canadian diocese found this unacceptable, and Theodorovich was forced to resign his position as primate of the Canadian Church in 1946. The Canadian diocese then requested that the Ukrainian Synod in Europe to send them a bishop, which they did in the person of Mstislav Skripnik, a dynamic, energetic, and visionary individual whose goal was to unite the Canadian, American, and European dioceses into one Ukrainian Orthodox Church in the free world. As can be imagined, Theodorovich's irregular canonical status called into question the legitimacy of the priests he had ordained in Canada and the USA. After coming to Canada, Mstislav quietly ordained the Canadian clergy and sought to have Theodorovich's canonical status regularized. Because of this, as well as his positive attitude towards canonical recognition, Archbishop Mstislav was dismissed by the Canadian Diocese in 1950 and will return to Canada a little later in this talk. An extraordinary session of the American Consistory in October 1947 reached a decision to ask Theodorovich to take all steps before Archbishop Athenagoras necessary for the canonical regularization of his episcopal status and for entry into the structure of the Constantinople Patriarchate. Archbishop John agreed to accept canonical episcopal consecration, which he did from the hands of Mstislav and Bishop Christophoros, the exarch of the Alexandrian Patriarchate, on August 27, 1949, following which, in accordance with directives received from the Ukrainian bishops in Europe, he reordained all the priests he had earlier ordained in the USA. From this point forward, the question of canonical ordination was no longer an issue for the Ukrainians, but the question of church independence remained a sticking point. In the subsequent negotiations to unite Theodorovich and Mstislav's larger diocese with the smaller Ukrainian Orthodox Church of America, issues of maintaining a church structure independent of the Greek Archdiocese and demands by the bishop of the smaller diocese to lead this united church resulted in a second failure to achieve recognition, and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the USA remained in canonical isolation. The third major attempt to enter into Eucharistic communion with the ecumenical throne, again by the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the USA, as Canada had stepped away from the table, took place in 1971. With the assistance of Archbishop Yakovos, Archbishop Mstislav met with Patriarch Athenagoras, and in December of that year, Archbishop Yakovos informed Mstislav that, quote, His Holiness, Ecumenical Patriarch Athenagoras and the Holy Synod of the Ecumenical Patriarchate await your church's formal application for acceptance in the jurisdiction of the Mother Ecumenical Patriarchate, as well as your report on the bishops, priests, and number of parishes in your church, end quote. Mstislav sent the requested materials to the Fanar in February of 1972, asking that the Patriarch respect, quote, the rights and privileges of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church as they were cherished by the Kiev Metropolitanate from its inception in the 12th century up to its annexation to the Moscow Patriarchate in the 17th century, end quote. Patriarch Athenagoras reposed later that year, and Mstislav did not receive a reply until May of 1973. Mstislav was deeply disappointed with the Holy Synod's response, as it envisioned the Ukrainian parishes being incorporated into the Greek Archdiocese, de facto removed him as the ruling bishop of a diocese, and to his mind was disrespectful of the history of the, quote, martyred Ukrainian Orthodox Church, end quote. Mstislav went on to suggest that Constantinople's approach paralleled that of Moscow, that is, that it was an attempt to, quote, terminate the existence of our church in the free world, end quote, and asked that the Holy Synod reconsider its decision. The Synod's conditions for recognizing the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the USA were not only unacceptable to the Ukrainians, but taken by Mstislav as a slap in the face. Though respectful relations were maintained between the Greek Archdiocese and the American Metropolis through the 70s and 80s, the inability of the Patriarchate to receive the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the USA under her homophorion as a church, whether this would be as an exarchate, an ethnic diocese, or a separate metropolia, that had its own administrative structure and autonomy, colored the relations between the Patriarchate and the American Metropolia for the next 20 years and was a serious obstacle to further attempts at recognition until after Mstislav's repose in 1993. Returning to Canada, in 1951, Ilarion Ohienko, a well-known and greatly respected churchman and scholar, was elected Metropolitan by the Ukrainian Greek Orthodox Church of Canada. Hilarion had been consecrated bishop within the Polish Autocephalous Orthodox Church before World War II, and upon his departure for North America, was transferred into the jurisdiction of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Though Archbishop Athinagoras had originally attempted to have him lead the Ukrainian diocese under the Ecumenical Patriarchate in the USA, this proved unsuccessful, and Ohienko went on to become the ruling hierarch of the Canadian Church. While both Hilarion and his successor, Metropolitan Andrei, favored communion with Constantinople, the ideological position of the Canadian Church, based upon the principles of complete church independence, self-sufficiency, and conciliar governance, would not permit any consideration of official canonical recognition from or by another ecclesiastical body. Father Semen Sauchuk, one of the founders and chief ideologues of the Ukrainian Greek Orthodox Church of Canada, held staunchly to these principles, and given his authoritative voice and eminent status within the Church, no serious move towards canonical recognition would have been possible during his lifetime. If, based upon their lived historical experience, the Ukrainians were generally allergic to external domination, the Canadians were especially allergic. In this diagram, we see, in broad terms, the interrelationship between the various bodies at about the beginning of the 1980s. Both the UOC of the USA and the Church in Canada had been informed by both the 21 and 42 instantiations of the Autocephalous Church. They both had relationships with the Archdiocese. All three had relationships with the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and the UOC of America was between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea with the Greek Archdiocese and the Ukrainian diocese in the States. So at that point, in the early 80s, what were the fundamental obstacles to the canonical recognition of the Ukrainian Metropolis? From the standpoint of the Greek Archdiocese, there had originally been well-founded insecurity as to the apostolic succession of Archbishop Theodorovich, and therefore the priest ordained by him. By the 1980s, this issue had been resolved, but anti-Ukrainian bias and pressure from Moscow-oriented churches was still an issue. From the Ukrainian standpoint, the obstacles were of a cultural historical nature, in that due to its colonial history, the Ukrainians, experiencing freedom in the New World, were extremely reticent to enter under the aegis of any bishop or diocese which might circumscribe their independence. This reticence was undoubtedly a result of their experience as colonial and imperial subjects. It took on an especially ideological character in Canada, and quite probably was also a reaction against their former experience as Uniates. The memory of, quote, being sold to Moscow by Constantinople in 1686, unquote, wouldn't go away. And the maintenance of church independence and internal administrative structure was a non-negotiable. On top of it all, divergent conceptions of autocephaly and canonicity, church culture and polity could not help but be a challenge to mutual understanding. But change was in the air. In October of 1987, Metropolitan Vasily Fedak and Father Stefan Yarmus of the Ukrainian Greek Orthodox Church of Canada traveled to the Near East with the goal of visiting the ancient patriarchates, informing them about the Ukrainian Church in Canada, and inviting them to take part in the upcoming celebration of the millennium of the baptism of Rus Ukraine. Following their return, a decision was taken by the consistory of the Church, quote, to continue the already begun contacts with the above-mentioned centers, and eventually to enter into dialogue with the goal of the normalization of our relationships with these centers, and especially with the Ecumenical Patriarchate, end quote. The resulting dialogue with the Fanar was greatly facilitated by Archbishop Yakovos, the Chancellor of the Exarchate at that time, Bishop Isaiah, and the Patriarchal administration in Constantinople. Negotiations in regard to points of agreement between the Patriarchate and the Canadian Metropolia took place over the coming year, with the goal of drafting a document respecting the history, traditions, and ecclesiological identity of the Canadian body, as well as the canonical prerogatives and practices of the ecumenical throne. The clergy and faithful of the Ukrainian Greek Orthodox Church of Canada approved this document at an extraordinary sobor on October 21st, 1989. Following further negotiations and clarifications, the approved points of agreement were accepted by the Patriarchate, and in March of 1990, Patriarch Demetrius invited Metropolitan Vasily to concelebrate with him in Constantinople. On April 1st of 1990, Metropolitan Vasily's vicar, Bishop Yuri of Saskatoon, concelebrated the Divine Liturgy with Patriarch Demetrius in Constantinople, and the Ukrainian Greek Orthodox Church of Canada entered into Eucharistic communion with World Orthodoxy. And this act was confirmed at the regular Sobor of the Church in July of the same year. How did the process culminate in the USA? Following the repose of Metropolitan Mstislav, the process in this case was initiated by the Patriarchate. As communicated to the membership of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the USA in 1995, Metropolitan Constantine and Archbishop Anthony had been invited to Constantinople late in 1994 by Patriarch Bartholomew, who, quote, spoke of his anguish over the situation of the Church in Ukraine and expressed his and the Holy See's desire that the unity of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in diaspora and in Ukraine be achieved at the earliest possible date, end quote. The bishops presented a detailed report of this meeting to the Metropolitan Council in December of 1994, informing the Council that, quote, the Ecumenical Patriarch was prepared to recognize and accept under his omophorion the entire Church in the USA and diaspora without infringing upon the unique identity, constitutional integrity, or administrative independence of our ecclesiastical bodies, stating that nothing will change in the structure and administration of our Church, end quote. Having been assured of the support of the other bishops of the Church, the Metropolitan Council in February of 1995 unanimously passed a motion approving the goal of bringing the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the USA, quote, into communion with World Orthodoxy through the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople, end quote. Metropolitan Constantine and Archbishop Anthony traveled to Constantinople with a group of 38 pilgrims in March of 1995, where, on the Sunday of Orthodoxy, they concelebrated the Holy Liturgy with Patriarch Bartholomew, and the American Metropolia was brought into Eucharistic communion with World Orthodoxy. As in Canada, this action was confirmed at the subsequent Sobor of the Church. In conclusion, did the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese play a crucial role in the canonical recognition of the Ukrainian metropolias in North America? In regard to the Canadian metropolia, the answer is a clear and unequivocal yes. In the USA, while the role of the Archdiocese was not crucial, it was important. The Patriarchate's earlier desire to minimize or erase the Ukrainian diocesan structures and simply integrate the parishes into the dioceses of the Greek Archdiocese resulted in the process being suspended for decades. But to the credit of both sides, brotherly contacts were maintained and valuable assistance was rendered to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the USA by the Greek Archdiocese. Would the Ukrainian metropolias have achieved canonical recognition without the help of the Greek Archdiocese? Perhaps, but unlikely. There had been attempts by the Alexandrian Patriarchate, following the consecration of Archbishop John in 1949, to receive the Ukrainian diocese into its jurisdiction, but these were not given serious consideration. And finally, why was the Greek Archdiocese interested in helping out the Ukrainian Orthodox churches in North America to achieve canonical recognition? A hermeneutic of suspicion might result in questioning the motives of the Greek Archdiocese in assisting the Ukrainian metropolias. When recognition had been proposed with the stipulation that Ukrainian parishes would simply be folded into the local Greek diocese, the Ukrainian response was negative, based, among other things, on the suspicion that the Greeks weren't interested in the Ukrainians themselves, but only as a means of increasing the size, prestige, and power of their own archdiocese. A generous reading of the motives of the Greek Archdiocese, however, clearly shows an honest and sympathetic attitude toward the Ukrainians. Patriarch Athinagoras is remembered by the Ukrainians fondly and with great respect, yet from his time as exarch in North America. Archival evidence clearly demonstrates that Archbishop Iakovos was directly involved and extremely helpful in facilitating the meetings and negotiations which resulted in the canonical recognition of the Canadian Metropolia. Notwithstanding the strained relationship between Archbishop Yakovos and Metropolitan Mstislav in the USA, the record of fraternal greetings and meetings, mutual exchange of invitations to church events, and especially the official and unofficial assistance offered by priests and bishops of the Greek Archdiocese to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the USA, witnessed to the important role played by the Archdiocese in the canonical recognition of the Ukrainian Metropolias in North America by the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Thank you.
Oh, no. Okay, thank you. Father Bogdan, thank you very, very much. That was fascinating. We have a minute for a point of clarification question, if anybody has a particular question for sort of historical or clarification. Okay, we'll ask you to stay online if you can, and we'll have some questions at the end of the session. Next, I'd like to welcome Father Oliver on the screen, and I think we're going to make the switch here. We're working on that. Hello, Father Oliver.
Hello. Can you hear me?
We sure can. So welcome. And Father Oliver will be speaking to us on the title of America's Red Scare and the Fourth Major Faith. Father Oliver, it's all yours.
Thank you. Before I begin, I'd like to note the Cardinals lead the Phillies 2-0. With that note made, thank you, Dr. Skedros, and everyone who has made this possible, as well as my co-panelists, Father Bogdan and Matthew. It's good to virtually be here. Just as a matter of course, because I am a chaplain in the armed services and in the Air Force, and I'm going to speak on something that does involve the DoD and military as part of my paper. I want to make it very clear I'm speaking of myself, not of any kind of Air Force or DoD policy. This is just me, myself, and I for whatever that is worth. Beginning in the 1940s, Orthodox Christians in America went on the offensive regarding their religious freedom. Prior to this time, they had been bogged down in fights to preserve their religious rights, primarily in Alaska. In the 1940s, however, Orthodox in New York obtained recognition for Eastern Orthodoxy from the Selective Service. This galvanized many, especially those within the Greek Orthodox community, and led to an attempt at the federal recognition of Orthodoxy as, quote, the fourth major faith in the 1950s. This journey included an attempt to unify most of the Orthodox jurisdictions, something Matthew had mentioned briefly yesterday, a claim that doing so furthered the, quote, Americanization of the Orthodox, a defense of the Russian Orthodox Church and Russia's communist government, and an appeal to justice and morality. Although later successful in many state legislatures, it failed to get out of committee at the federal level. And one of the central reasons for this was the fear that providing such recognition to Orthodox Christians inevitably opened the door to communist infiltration in America, a fear that some Orthodox themselves actually helped contribute to. And the main antagonist to the Orthodox maneuver was a man named Carl Mcintyre, who was a highly popular and politically active fundamentalist Presbyterian pastor. And although hardly the only American Protestant to be concerned with possible connection between Orthodox and communists, Mcintyre successfully leveraged that fear, effectively guaranteeing that the resolution died in committee. So the beginnings of this, in the spring of 1942, John Gelsinger of Buffalo, New York, was drafted by the Selective Service. He had intended already to be ordained as an Orthodox priest, so he went to his bishop, Metropolitan Anthony, and said, hey, what should we do? And basically, Anthony ordained him, and he then informed the Selective Service, hey, Gelsinger can't be drafted. And despite his ordination, despite this, and despite the prior decision to do this, the Selective Service Board designated John Gelsinger as 1 Alpha rather than 4 Delta. 4 Delta would have exempted him as a pastor. He could have served as a chaplain, but he would have been exempted as having to bear combat arms. So John Gelsinger's father, Michael Gelsinger, who also was an Orthodox priest and a convert professor at the University of Buffalo, he went to a friend of his, George E. Phillies. Phillies was a local Greek Orthodox attorney, and he went to the local board and the state board in Albany. They got nowhere, so finally ended up appealing to the federal authorities. Brigadier General Louis B. Hershey was the one in charge, and he had a major Dunkel, I believe the guy's name was, organize a hearing on the matter. And according to Phillies, this entire process galvanized the Orthodox, and it led to a meeting of 4 hierarchs: Archbishop Athenagoras of the Greek Archdiocese, Metropolitan Benjamin of the Russian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate, Bishop Dionysia of the Serbian Orthodox Church, and Metropolitan Antony of the Syrian Orthodox Church. And so but the main organizer behind this, the guys kind of moving behind the bishops, were Michael Gelsinger and Boris Burden, who himself was also a convert priest. And Michael Gelsinger obtained the cooperation of Archbishop Athenagoras, his own bishop, Antony, while Burden basically is the one who got Benjamin and Dionysia on board. And at one point, things really seemed to go south, because Burden even wrote a letter in defense of John Gelsinger saying why he shouldn't be drafted. And very shortly thereafter, Burden's own Selective Service Board sent him a notice that, hey, you're drafted too. So this got Phillies really geared up. And so he appealed to his congressman, James W. Wadsworth, saying that, hey, the Orthodox are, quote, law-abiding, respecters of authority, loyal Americans, devoted patriots. And he asked him to speak directly to the Secret Service in Washington. And he certainly feared that what happened with Burden was going to happen with others, that as more Orthodox spoke out about this, they would end up being targeted by their own local Selective Service boards. At one point, Philly said, "It is more difficult than I had expected and too important to orthodoxy. My blood is just boiling to think how the rights of the people of the Orthodox Church are ignored as if we were insignificant," end quote. So basically, the upshot is that on December 8th, 1942, Major Simon Dunkel signs the paperwork and approves it. And so this allowed EO to be stamped on dog tags in order to stand for Eastern Orthodox, and Orthodox priests would have the opportunity to serve as chaplains. However, this really was honestly mostly effective, if not exclusively effective, in New York. And we know that because by the 1950s, we started the press for this fourth major faith movement. So although Phillies, the Gelsingers, and Burden had succeeded in getting recognition in New York, they didn't want to stop there. And so, as Matthew had mentioned yesterday, there was this push to get all 4 of the hierarchs together and try to create a federation. Basically, I think it's fair the way Matthew characterized it, sort of a SCOBA before SCOBA. And Governor Dewey of New York signed the bill on March 25th in 43. I mean, made a big to-do. I have not listened to it, nor have I, to be honest, really dug hard and tried to find it. But apparently, he gave a radio address at the time as well. So anyway, it really took off. But one of the things about this is that one of the main motivations was not just to bring the Orthodox together, but also to continue furthering this idea of what became called the fourth major faith. Gelsinger believed that Americans needed to know that there was more to the Judeo-Christian tradition than Protestant, Catholic, and Jew. That's basically that was the construct prior to the 1950s. And he was particularly upset that the Orthodox were regularly left out of events, especially prayers on Armistice Day. And he called for Orthodox Christians to obtain recognition from their fellow Americans. He got the Episcopal Church weighed in on this. One of their bishops, Cameron Davis, said, quote, he made a public appeal. He said, "It makes the oldest of all the branches of the Catholic Church an integral part of our social and religious structures. I hope that it may be approved." But related to this as well was this in the background. This is happening if we move into the 40s and the 50s. Of course, America is going through the Red Scare. And so in the background of this, you've got this, well, what do you do about the Russian component? And so part of the concern for Americanization at least on the part of Burden and a few others, included making an apology on behalf of the Russian communist regime's treatment of the Orthodox and how the Orthodox Church was responding under that. So Burden made an apology, basically published an apologia in the Buffalo Evening News. He dedicated a significant amount of space to speaking on behalf of the Moscow Patriarch, claimed that the Russian clergy who had been prosecuted were not prosecuted because of their faith, but because they had joined counter-revolutionary organizations. I'm not sure what the difference is, but furthermore, although the state seized church property, the churches were predominantly free for worship, according to Burden, and in cases where their purpose had been changed, and we know how some of those were changed, all religious valuables and sacramental items have been carefully preserved. Yeah. So anyway, he asserted that the Nazis persecuted the Orthodox much more directly. I mean, hey, if your other arguments aren't working, just, blame somebody else who you think is worse. And that there had been no censorship of mail, even though there was evidence to the contrary. Now, the Federation itself fractured. It fractured in large part over disciplinary issues concerning George Phillies. He had communed in both the Orthodox and Protestant Episcopal churches. Now, to be fair to Phillies, when he first came to America, there was no Orthodox parish for him to go to. But nonetheless, that didn't satisfy Burden, and so it basically fractured. But this response to the Judeo-Christian construct that began in 1940 continued with this thrust of Americanization of the Orthodox continued. So Gelsinger believed that, as I had said, that he believed that, hey, Americans need to know more about this. But there was also the press that, hey, this is a way to also make Orthodox good Americans as well. It's like two sides to this coin. So in the 1950s, the Orthodox were again asking to be recognized because the Selective Service decision for New York really wasn't panning out across the other 50, or the other, what we now call 49. Wasn't 49 yet. But this time through the introduction of Senate Bill 106 in the 84th Congress. So this is going into 55, I think. And so basically they were saying, hey, we're going to make a piece of legislation that the president's going to sign that will make us a fourth major faith, allow us to have EO on our dog tags, and every selective service board has to listen to us. The Department of Defense, through the Department of the Army, initially refused to change policy. Once they realized, hey, this bill is in committee, it's going to go somewhere, they then actually agreed to it. And the pressure to have Orthodoxy recognized as a fourth major faith, I mean, this occurred largely under Archbishop Michael. I know he was talked about yesterday as well. And Archbishop Michael decided not to stop with the federal military policy change, but desired official governmental recognition, even beyond that. So for him, he believed it was a matter of justice. And one of the Christian newspapers talking about and dealing with all of this at the time was Christian Century. It's a Protestant paper. And in 1956, he wrote to Harold Fay, the editor, and he said, quote, when we ask for the recognition of the Eastern Orthodox Church as one of the major faiths, we as American citizens ask for justice and nothing else. And indeed, by 1961, 25 states would recognize at the state level Orthodox Christianity as a fourth major faith. But the federal attempt, as I had mentioned, failed, and one of the reasons it failed was because of anti-communist fears. So Archbishop Michael and many Orthodox Christians expected things to go initially the way they had played out with the Selective Service and recognition by the U.S. Armed Forces. And so this was it. So they said, hey, let's push this. And so they went through Senator Clifford P. Case of New Jersey. And Senator Case publicly agreed that, hey, there's events where you have Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish representatives, but you don't have an Orthodox one. And so ultimately he came up with Resolution 88. Now, Resolution 88 did not make it out of the Judiciary Committee. That's where it died. And the Senate never had a chance to vote on it. The most vocal opponents of the American Orthodox efforts for further recognition were American Protestants, who were concerned that Eastern Orthodoxy could be a vehicle for spreading global communism. And by the time Harold Fay, in his role as editor, voiced his opposition to the idea of recognition of Orthodoxy as a fourth major faith in 1956, many Americans had already been eyeing Orthodoxy's relationship to and even internal division over communism. And Christian Century had been fanning some of those flames of concerns in other earlier articles. In 1947 to 48, for instance, the same Christian century noted the ongoing negotiation between the American and Russian representatives of the Russian Orthodox faith. I mean, we know that that's there's a whole history there. They noted the split in the Serbian community, that was along political lines and often characterized as, either for or against the communist regime. And in fact, in a 1947 article, they accepted Bishop Dionysius' contention that the American Serb Congress was nothing more than a communist front. So in 1951, the magazine also highlighted a Supreme Court decision that noted there was a lot of this, and Matthew could probably speak a lot to this. But basically, in 1951, a Supreme Court decision ceded St. Nicholas Cathedral in New York to the Russian Orthodox Church rather than the Russian Orthodox Greek Catholic Church of America. And so, they noted this and they said, whoa, hey, there's a quote, many Americans, however, will be startled to discover from this decision the extent to which churches under foreign authority can challenge with legal impunity the convictions of the people of the United States. So that's how they were looking at this court case. And so between that and the Serbian split, Protestant, unfortunately, didn't need to dig deep to justify their concerns. The Orthodox were doing a good job. You start pointing fingers at each other. You're a communist, you're a communist, you're a collaborator, you're a collaborator. Well, to a Protestant on the outside, they're like, you might all be collaborators. The heck with all you. So, I mean, some of it was self-caused. But it was neither ultimately internal Orthodox division nor even the concerns of the Christian century that ultimately did it in. The loudest and most successful person who objected to it was Carl Mcintyre, as I had mentioned. Carl Mcintyre was a fundamentalist Presbyterian preacher. He had founded, among other things, the Bible Presbyterian Church, which was a large church in the 50s and even into the 60s and 70s. It dwindled, but a weekly newspaper known as the Christian Beacon, and a successful and popular radio ministry. Honestly, he had a huge radio ministry. And although Mcintyre is often omitted in American evangelical history because he was a very caustic, aggressive person in his personality, so even a lot of his fellow evangelical and conservative Protestants and such really didn't like him. His opposition to the fourth major faith movement occurred, after this, a decade in which anti-communist fears were still very prevalent. And so when Senator Case first introduced the bill, concerns with communism, were not a major concern. As he put it, the bill was, quote, intended as public recognition of the fact that the American citizens of Eastern Orthodox faith constitute a substantial segment of our community, separate from the three major faiths already designated, and justly entitled to consideration in any federal action or statement related to religious matters. However, Mcintyre, who had a history of involving himself in political action against red clergy, so-called, both Orthodox, he didn't like some Russian Orthodox hierarchy visiting earlier in the century, and also in the case of liberal Protestants, he watched congressional proceedings really closely, and he responded within a month's time to Case's fourth major faith bill. Within a month, he was already writing and speaking against it. And although by 1961 he had suffered some political setbacks, it's not like he was a lobbyist who could just dictate how senators voted, he still had some allies. One of his political allies was Benjamin Mandel, who was the research director for the internal subcommittee. And Mcintyre provided two lines of argumentation when he reached out to Mandel. First, he said the Eastern Orthodox Church is a part of what is known as the Catholic branch. Apparently, that's an argument against Orthodox, if you're Protestant, I suppose. Second, the resolution would allegedly enable, quote, communist-directed units of the Eastern Orthodox Church to have certain advantages with the United States government, end quote. Never defined what those were. So fear-mongering, basically. But demonstrating his usual commitment to see things through to the nth degree. Again, I said he was kind of a caustic, aggressive person. Mcintyre asked for at least a dozen copies of the resolution personally, and then he wanted to take it to the April Convention of the American Council of Christian Churches, which was a Protestant organization, and he wanted to be informed of any hearing on the resolution so that he could attend and voice his objection. He had a history of doing that with other issues. He really liked to make a noise. So Mcintyre's letter set the tone for future considerations, and the bill basically died in committee. His letter was passed along to Senator Eastland, the Judiciary Committee chairman, with its own memorandum asking that it be included in the full committee file. At the same time, the committee received the Mcintyre letters. Senator Case also wrote, and he asked for a public hearing to be allowed in April to coincide with the visit of the Premier of Greece, Constantine Karamanlis, to the U.S., but Senator Eastland simply noted, hey, I'll discuss it with Senator Dirksen, who's also on the committee, and we'll see, and we'll get back to you. But apparently I have no record that any hearing or any of that ever happened. Orthodox themselves feared that anti-communism could be hindering the committee's decision. I mean, at some point they thought, hey, you know, they were getting wind of some of this. So there were some others who wrote in, actually, a Mr., I don't know this person, but Mr. Nicholas Borak of New Jersey wrote to Senator Eastland himself, and then also Father John Limberakis, head pastor of Annunciation Greek Orthodox Church in Providence, Rhode Island, wrote to his senator, Senator Fogarty. All of this is in the congressional archives. So in the end, though, it didn't matter. The bill just died in committee. It just went nowhere. It just died a quiet death. So one can't go so far as to claim that anti-communism and Carl McIntyre killed Senate Resolution 88 on its own. The State Department, to be fair, did point out to the Judiciary Committee that recognizing Orthodoxy might open the door to having to recognize other religious groups. And Senator Dirksen, when pressed on the resolution status 5 years later, and now we're into the mid-60s, claimed that the resolution could be interpreted as favoring a religion, and he didn't want to go there. So nonetheless, anti-communism and Carl McIntyre definitely created a mountain that the judiciary just simply refused to climb. Recommending passage of the resolution to the Senate would have meant the committee would have been willing to take on the anti-communist feelings that linked Orthodoxy and communist regimes, as we saw in the Christian Century and McIntyre had done. But it also would have meant the committee believed in the principle of an official fourth major faith, sincerely enough to take on McIntyre and his political allies. In the end, American Orthodox Christians had gone as far to claim religious freedom as they could. From, you know, if you think about it, from the desperation of self-preservation in Alaska to taking on the selective service in New York, to the official recognition as a religion by the Department of Defense in 1955, and then to a designation as a fourth major faith by half the states in the Union, Orthodox Christianity had come a long way. Were it not for anti-communism, it's conceivable that Orthodoxy, led by the efforts of Archbishop Michael and the Greek Archdiocese, might have gone further.
Thank you very much, Father Oliver. I know that you have to leave in a couple of minutes, so why don't we take about 5 minutes and ask any questions for Father Oliver, and then if he has to take off while we're still moving forward, you can do that. So I'll open the floor for any questions for Father Oliver. Tony?
Father Oliver, thank you. This has been really interesting. I've done my own stuff on this topic as well. And one of the things that I find so interesting is the need to be recognized, because it seems like and how do you take that need to be recognized not only by the Orthodox but by that the government has to recognize religious groups as somehow having standing, having legitimacy in American life?
Yeah, I think it's, and by the way, just so everyone knows, it's drill weekend for us, which is why I couldn't make it and why I have to leave shortly. So, I mean, there's a lot of green under this cassock. You know, I take it as it's part of the Americanization of, or this drive for Americanization, I should say. There was this sense amongst Orthodox, really throughout much of the 20th century, to prove that they were good Americans, to prove that this is also part of the by the mid-century they would say the Judeo-Christian construct. So like in Illinois, across the river from St. Louis, where I attended while I was working my PhD, honestly, it was not, what was it, up through the 60s, I think, maybe into the 70s yet. I think into the 70s. I think Father Thomas Zuccarati told me when he showed up, they were still carrying the American flag during the procession around the church at Pascha. And so that would have been in the 70s yet. So I think it's part of that. But I also think it's more than that as well. I think it was, to their credit, I mean, the Greeks especially, but it wasn't just Greeks that I mentioned here, but certainly it was the Greeks who took the lead on this particular issue. I think there was also this sense that a realization that, well, the way America is set up is the Constitution gives religious freedom, but you also kind of got to be recognized, and there's a blind spot here. And then also, just to be honest, it's in the history, even going back to Alaska, where you write to President McKinley, because in the old world, church-state relations were that way. Your head hierarch wrote to your head governing representative, and you tried to hammer things out. So I think it's sort of a old world methodology transplanted to the new world, but then colored with this concern of, well, who's a good American? And you just kind of stir it all together, and you have this weird concoction.
Yes, Father Costi.
Just a quick question. Thank you so much, Father, for a wonderful presentation. What do you think would have been the consequences still today if we were recognized back then as a fourth major religion?
I think by today we'd probably be pretty similar to where we are already. And the reason I say that, I think it would have just, to be honest, it would have been a blip on the radar, because through court litigations and such, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but I know just enough to know, and I have to know what different DOD regulations and Air Force instructions and all this stuff says on that. We've come to a point now where, honestly, the concern is no longer keeping a list of what are approved religions or what are recognized religions by the DOD or by the government. The latest AFI, that's Air Force instruction, that just came out last summer, came out just in time for religious accommodation for the COVID, which could be its own conference. That actually emphasizes sincerely held belief. Rather than any particular faith. So I think we would have ended up where we are now, regardless. However, would it have given some momentum and a sense of pride and other things at a level that didn't exist? Sure. And would that have had ripple effects? I'm sure. What would that have looked like? God didn't give me the gift of prophecy. I'm sorry.
So before we say thank you, anecdotally, I think I would reverse the question and make an observation, as you just said, that growing up in my family, my dad was an American historian, taught high school. He always told us that we were recognized as the fourth faith. In other words, he wore that as a badge to remind us as Orthodox that we have arrived, regardless of whether, and I don't even know if he knew that the federal government hadn't done it, but at least states had done it. And so it was a badge of respectability. So it played a role, at least in some conscious identity, for Orthodox Christians in America.
And, Russian identity was poisoned.
Well, thank you. And again, thank you for the opportunity. I do apologize for squeezing this in between.
Thank you so much
things.
for joining us. We really appreciate it. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, our last paper here is by Matthew Namey, and a nice way to go out with a very non-controversial topic, the origins of the barbarian lands theory, the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America, and the interpretation of Canon 28 of Calcedon. And I would just have to say, I've followed Matthew's work on his blog, but I've never met him. But now his personality reflects his ability. As far as what I've learned from you in the last 2 days is your personality reflects your tharos, as we say in Greek, your courage to take on this topic. So welcome.
In 12, 13 years ago, I was at an anniversary conference. I was invited to speak at an anniversary conference for the OCA. I think it was their 40th anniversary conference. And I gave a paper called The Myth of Unity, and explained that not everyone was once under the Russians in America. So to give a little context. Well, they never invited me back. In 1924, the future Patriarch Christophoros of Alexandria, who was then Metropolitan of Leontopolis, published an article called The Position of the Ecumenical Patriarchate in the Orthodox Church. Christophoros opens by explaining the reason for his study. The tendency that the Ecumenical Patriarchate has had over the past 2 years to desire to extend its spiritual jurisdiction over every ecclesiastical territory or every community which, for one reason or another, was or appeared to be deprived of regular spiritual government and oversight, which one describes as churches of the diaspora. Christophoros presents this as something novel, something that emerged over the past 2 years, that is, since 1922, 100 years ago, the anniversary of this archdiocese. One of the keystone prerogatives claimed by the Ecumenical Patriarchate is its jurisdiction over the so-called diaspora, regions not included within the geographic boundaries of the other autocephalous churches. Many churches don't accept this claim, kind of obviously evidenced by the presence of Antiochian, Russian, Serbian, Romanian, Bulgarian, and Georgian jurisdictions here in the United States and elsewhere in the diaspora. But the Ecumenical Patriarchate insists that this exclusive extraterritorial jurisdiction is in fact ancient, rooted in Canon 28 of Calcedon, the Fourth Ecumenical Council in the year 451. Canon 28 is a fascinating text. First, it acknowledges that the Bishop of Constantinople now has privileges equal to the Bishop of Rome, and it explains its rationale. It says this is due to the fact that Constantinople is now the imperial capital and the seat of the Senate. In the second half of the canon, it declares, only the metropolitans of the Pontian, Asian, and Thracian dioceses, as well as the bishops of the aforementioned dioceses among barbarians, are ordained by the aforementioned most holy throne of the most holy Church of Constantinople. Thanks to Father Patrick Viscuso for the translation. This phrase, the bishops of the aforementioned dioceses among the barbarians, is central to the Ecumenical Patriarchate's canonical claim to exclusive jurisdiction in the diaspora. In 2009, the faculty of this institution, Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology, issued a statement that was called The Leadership of the Ecumenical Patriarchate and the Significance of Canon 28 of Calcedon. The statement included the following paragraph. Canon 28 of Calcedon explicitly granted to the Bishop of Constantinople the pastoral care for those territories beyond the geographical boundaries of the other local autocephalous churches. At the time of the 5th century, these regions commonly were referred to as barbarian nations because they were outside the Byzantine Commonwealth. St. Paul in Romans 1:14 also had used the term barbarians to refer to those beyond the old Roman Empire. Canon 28 of Calcedon appears to clarify the reference in Canon 2 of the Council of Constantinople, which says that the churches in the barbarian lands should be governed according to the tradition established by the fathers. So that's, according to the faculty of this institution, that is how that phrase is to be interpreted. And that is the justification for the claim the Ecumenical Patriarchate has over the so-called diaspora. But that's not what the canon explicitly says. It says that this is what the canon explicitly says. It doesn't explicitly say that. It's an interpretation of what the canon explicitly says. On its face, the canon seems to refer only to bishops who belong to the dioceses of Pontus, Asia, and Thrace who are ministering among barbarians. This raises the question, where did the modern diaspora interpretation originate? The obvious place to begin looking is the standard canonical commentaries. Zonaras writes of the phrase in question, they assign to Constantinople also the ordination of bishops in the barbarian nations which were in the aforementioned dioceses, which are the Alans and the Rus, for the former are adjacent to the Pontian diocese and the Rus to the Thracian. Balsamon explains the boundaries of Pontus, Asia, and Thrace. He gives some geographic detail explaining, clarifying where these exact boundaries are. And then he states that the Alans, the Rus, and others are bishops in barbarian lands. Then Aristonos tells us, only the metropolitans of Pontus, Asia, and Thrace will be subject to him, the Patriarch of Constantinople, the Bishop of Constantinople, and ordained by him, likewise also the bishops of the barbarians in such dioceses. These commentators all hold to a very literal interpretation of the phrase, the bishops of the aforementioned dioceses among barbarians. At the turn of the 19th century, we come to St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain, who in the Pedalion repeats Zonaras, saying, not only I'm quoting here, "Not only are the metropolitans of the said dioceses to be ordained by him, but indeed also the bishops located in barbarian regions that border on the said dioceses, as for instance, those called Alani are adjacent to and flank the diocese of Pontus, while the Russians border on that of Thrace. Nowhere in the commentaries, from Zonaras and Balsamon in the 12th century up to St. Nicodemus at the beginning of the 19th, is there any hint of the modern barbarian lands theory. The late Metropolitan Maximus of Sardis, in his 1976 book on the Ecumenical Patriarchate, writes extensively about the barbarian language in Canon 28, but he also does not cite any older source in support of the modern barbarian lands theory. He simply just asserts that it is the interpretation. So where did this theory originate? As best I can determine, the earliest evidence for the modern theory appeared at the turn of the 20th century, when a large-scale Hellenic diaspora emerged across the globe, and most notably in the United States. Organized Orthodoxy first took root in the contiguous United States in the Civil War era, when multi-ethnic parishes were established in San Francisco under the Russian Church and in New Orleans, which was loosely connected with the Church of Greece. But it was not until the Ellis Island era of the 1890s that Orthodox parishes began emerging in America at any significant scale. In terms of raw population, the largest Orthodox group in the New World was the Greeks. In the years that followed, these Hellenic immigrants established churches across the United States, and these Greek churches were loosely connected, as we've heard in previous presentations, loosely connected either with the Ecumenical Patriarchate, sometimes the Church of Greece. Very occasionally, they were connected with Alexandria or Jerusalem. In practice, these new Greek churches were functionally independent. They were run by lay boards of trustees that hired and fired priests at will. Father John Erickson writes, "It is little wonder that a few parishes were misled into hiring impostors, usually vagrant monks who pretended to be ordained priests in order to obtain the fees customarily paid for performing baptisms, marriages, and other vital rites and ministrations." If you want to read some almost comical stories about like the infighting and the lack of hierarchical oversight, I wrote a paper I referenced called The Myth of Unity, where I tell some of these stories. You can find it online. For Greek Orthodoxy, America was a Wild West. It wasn't quite so chaotic for some of the other Orthodox ethnic groups in America. The Russian Church had an established archdiocese in America with a resident archbishop and priests who were appointed to their parishes in an orderly manner. The Antiochians and the Serbs had their own ethnic vicariates under the Russian archbishop. But while the Ecumenical Patriarchate never objected to this early Russian jurisdiction in America, at least not as I've ever been able to find, neither did it cede the Hellenic diaspora to the authority of the Russian archbishop. Eventually, the Ecumenical Patriarchate and the Church of Greece decided that something had to be done about these Greek communities. In 1907, the Patriarchate established a commission of 3 metropolitans to examine the issue of the growing Greek diaspora. Who had authority over these people and their churches? How should the Hellenic diaspora be administered? On November 12, 1907, the Patriarchal Commission presented its report in a meeting of the Holy Synod. A contemporary account summarizes the report and discussion as follows. The report concludes, basing itself on the Holy Canons, which are not quoted, that all Greek churches and communities abroad, not included in the canonical territory of an autocephalous church, depend on the Ecumenical Patriarchate. For the good success of this project, the Commission was of the opinion that the Ecumenical Patriarchate should write to the autocephalous sister churches and to ask the Ecumenical Patriarchate for formal consent for the appointment of hierarchs and clergy in charge of their annexes abroad. In this case, the Ecumenical Patriarchate would have no right to refuse. It would be, in short, a pure formality. His All Holiness, Patriarch Joachim III, disagreed. He proposed that in Europe, at least, things remain as they are, with communities everywhere continuing to depend on their own churches. As for the Greek communities in America, they would report directly to the Holy Synod of Athens. As best I can tell, this report is the earliest example of the barbarian lands theory of Canon 28, although the canon itself is not directly cited. It's noteworthy that the Patriarchal Commission and Patriarch Joachim himself disagreed about the application of this concept. The following March, 1908, Patriarch Joachim and his Holy Synod issued a tomos that ceded the Patriarchate's rights in the diaspora to the Church of Greece. The tomos clearly, in this case, sets forth the barbarian lands theory as the basis for the Patriarchate's jurisdiction in the diaspora, while at the same time focusing specifically on ethnic Greeks, not on all Orthodox Christians. The tomos begins by asserting that the Holy Synod is attempting to find, in the ancient canons, a basis for dealing with a specific pastoral challenge that has arisen. The Synod writes, "What we do now, through the present patriarchal and synodal tomos, is concerning those outside the established boundaries of the individual autocephalous ecclesiastical regions scattered in Europe and America and in other countries with Greek Orthodox churches, which until now are unstable and undefined in respect to a singular order of a canonical spiritual authority." Then the tomos goes on to lay out, for the first time in any kind of formal text, as far as I can tell, the barbarian lands theory. So I'm going to quote it because it's kind of important. Because the spiritual dependence of the said churches was thus abnormal and indefinite, the canonical order was clearly violated, for it was abundantly manifest that neither was the most holy Church of Greece under our patriarchal throne, being sovereign in its autocephaly with defined boundaries, nor was any other church or throne able to presume, by its own authority, to canonically reach beyond the boundaries of its own region, except for our most holy apostolic and patriarchal ecumenical throne, both from the prerogative granted to it to ordain bishops in the barbarian lands and those declared beyond defined ecclesiastical regions, as well as of itself by the intercessions properly justified to exercise supreme spiritual protection for said churches on foreign soil. The tomos then states that the Patriarchate cedes to the Church of Greece the right of oversight of all Greek Orthodox churches in the diaspora. Greek Orthodox churches. The tomos outlines various conditions. Holy chrism must come from the ecumenical patriarch, who is to be commemorated liturgically. Parish priests must receive a canonical appointment from the Holy Synod of Greece, and each parish must make financial contributions to the Patriarchate. Initially, we have a very expansive canonical claim. The reference to Constantinople's right to ordain the bishops in the barbarian lands is a clear invocation of Canon 28. And the tomos asserts that only Constantinople can canonically reach beyond the boundaries of its own region. According to the tomos, no other church may exercise jurisdiction in the diaspora, in regions beyond its defined canonical territory. This would presumably apply to the claims of the Russian church, which had bishops in America and Japan and in other places. But the tomos is clearly focused on Greeks, ethnic Greeks, not on Orthodox people in general. It's not that the tomos concedes these non-Greeks to the other Orthodox churches. It's that the tomos doesn't mention non-Greek Orthodox people in the diaspora at all. Under the 1908 tomos, the Church of Greece was to send a bishop to America, but the Greek parishes in the diaspora became even more divided and no bishop came. For 10 years until 1918, as you well know by now, this did not happen. This, of course, was the era of the Royalist Venizelist split, with Greek parishes in America dividing along political lines according to the factions in the Kingdom of Greece. Then, in 1918, the new Metropolitan of Athens, and I'll just note as a side note, the title Archbishop was not given to the primate of the Church of Greece until a few years later. So he was never actually Archbishop of Athens. He was Metropolitan of Athens. So Metaxakis, of course I'm speaking of. He traveled to the United States with his friend Bishop Alexander and began organizing the Greek parishes into what would become the Greek Archdiocese. This archdiocese held its first clergy laity congress in 1921, and at the same time, the entity was legally incorporated. So as an institution, this archdiocese marks its 100th anniversary last year in 2021. So why are we celebrating 2022 as the centennial of the archdiocese? By 1921, Meletios was persona non grata in Greece. His fortunes rose and fell along with his political ally Venizelos, and when the royalist faction regained the upper hand, Meletios was out as metropolitan. So he came back to America, but this time he was in exile. When the Greek Archdiocese was established in the summer of 1921, the ecclesiastical position of both the Archdiocese and Meletios was uncertain, to say the least. Everything took a dramatic turn at the end of the year. With the help of the British government, which then headed an allied occupation of Constantinople, Meletios was elected ecumenical patriarch. The throne had been vacant for 3 years during the Greco-Turkish War. So Meletios is elected at the end of 1921. Suddenly he goes from ousted Metropolitan of Athens to now the leading hierarch in the Orthodox world. He was enthroned in February of 1922. One of his first acts as patriarch, March 1st, 1922, was to revoke the 1908 Tomos and reestablish the Patriarchate's authority in the diaspora. This revocation was done via a praxis issued by Meletios and his Holy Synod. This document is the first place I'm aware of where a fully expansive, unrestrained barbarian lands theory is set forth with no limitation to ethnic Greeks. The praxis describes the 1908 Tomos as having granted to the Church of Greece the Patriarchate's canonical right of supreme power and protection over Greek Orthodox communities in the diaspora, which were outside the established boundaries of the most holy Orthodox autocephalous churches. The praxis specifies that these communities were Greek-speaking. It specifically says that. And because the Church of Greece had failed to successfully organize these communities, Constantinople was taking back its power over the diaspora. By her, quote, inviolable right to manage and conduct by her own authority the canonical authority belonging to her from the sacred canons and the ecclesiastical order, in which is included the ecclesiastical supervision of those outside and in the diaspora of Orthodox communities, end quote. So the praxis jumps from a focus on Greek-speaking people to all Orthodox communities of any ethnicity or language. And to remove any doubt as to the expansiveness of this claim, the praxis reaches its crescendo in its penultimate paragraph. Quoting again, she reinstates immediately complete and intact her ruling canonical rights and immediate supervision and governance without exception of all Orthodox communities found outside the boundaries of each of the autocephalous churches, whether in Europe or America or anywhere else, bringing them immediately under the immediate ecclesiastical dependence and guidance, and determines those that arise thereafter will belong only to her, and from her possess the validity of their ecclesiastical formation and actuality. Very expansive, right? Then on May 17th, a couple months later, Meletios and his Holy Synod issued a tomos establishing the Archdiocese of North and South America as an eparchy of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. This is what we're celebrating. That's the anniversary, May 17th. This May Tomos begins by reiterating the barbarian lands theory. The canonical ordinances, I'm quoting again, the canonical ordinances and the centuries-old practice of the Church ascribe the Orthodox communities which are found to be outside the canonical boundaries of the individual holy churches of God under the pastoral governance of the most holy apostolic patriarchal ecumenical throne. Unlike the 1908 Tomos, which begins with an seemingly expansive claim of territorial jurisdiction, but then shifts to focus only on the Hellenic diaspora. And unlike the earlier March 1922 praxis that revoked the 1908 Tomos, this new 1922 Tomos establishing this archdiocese makes no reference at all to ethnicity. The Tomos decrees that from now on, all Orthodox communities found in North and South America, and whatever Orthodox ecclesiastical bodies which exist now or henceforth shall be founded, are to be known as members of one body, namely the Orthodox Archdiocese of North and South America. Not the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese, the Orthodox Archdiocese. The Tomos ranks this archdiocese 15th in the ordering of the metropolises of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, establishes the structure of the archdiocese. The archdiocese is to be divided into dioceses, and the Tomos recommends 4 to begin with. Curiously, New York is not mentioned. The archbishop has Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia. Then the other 3 are Chicago, Boston, and California. The archbishop and the diocesan bishops comprise an eparchial synod. The Tomos gives the archdiocese quite a bit of independence, certainly much more independence than the current archdiocese has. In the case of a vacancy, either in the position of the archbishop or in the vacancy of one of the diocesan sees, the eparchial synod elects the replacement. So election happens within the Archdiocese by the Eparchial Synod. This is the procedure. So according to the Tomos, the Holy Synod of Constantinople has a list of eligible candidates for bishop. Then there is a standing council of clergy and laity, which is basically the equivalent of an archdiocesan council today or a metropolis council today. And this body would put forward its favored candidates, so basically nominations.
It's also based on the mixed council in Constantinople.
Not exactly. That's not exactly how the mixed council elected patriarchs. I don't think that's exactly how the mixed council. But anyway, let me continue. We can talk about that. Then the Eparchial Synod would take these nominees and they would elect from the list of nominees subject to approval by the Ecumenical Patriarch. Of course, none of this applies today. Ever since the restructuring of the Archdiocese in 1930 and 31, the Holy Synod of Constantinople has controlled the selection of new archbishops with no role for the Archdiocese itself in the selection process, except for an advisory role assigned to the Archdiocesan Council. As we've seen, the 1922 Tomos does not have an ethnic character. It seems to envision the Archdiocese as being the sole canonical body for all Orthodox Christians in North and South America. But the people of the Archdiocese, the actual faithful and the clergy and the hierarchy, have never had the pan-Orthodox character that seemed to be implied by the 1922 Tomos. The original charter of the Archdiocese, which was also issued in 1922, refers to it as the Greek Archdiocese. So it has all the ethnic sort of character. It's designed, the charter says it's designed for Orthodox Christians who use Greek as their liturgical language. The charter specifies, to make sure nobody has any doubt, that the Archdiocese exists to organize the spiritual life of Greeks and Orthodox Americans of Greek origin. So you have these kind of, these twin documents, but they kind of make two very different assertions. One is very expansive, one is very sort of ethnocentric. These two acts by Meletios and his synod were just a part of a flurry of activity by the Ecumenical Patriarchate. In March, the same month that the 1908 Tomos was rescinded, so March of 1922, Meletios spent a week negotiating. So he's enthroned in February. He gets there in February. March, he issues the Tomos. That week, he's negotiating with a Serbian Orthodox delegation about the autocephaly of the Serbian Church and making it a patriarchate, a unified patriarchate. Another Tomos creates the Metropolis for Great Britain to oversee parishes in Central and Western Europe. Then the Tomos of North and South America came in May. Then in September, Meletios issues a letter on the validity of Anglican orders. And it's not a coincidence on the Anglican thing that Great Britain was one of the decisive players in the as yet uncertain future of Turkey, and Meletios had for years publicly expressed hope that the Hagia Sophia might be returned to the Orthodox. Meletios' election and all the activity I just described took place during a period of stalemate in the Greco-Turkish War, which this was a tension-filled lull before the Asia Minor catastrophe. So in February and March, when Meletios was enthroned and when he rescinded the 1908 Tomos, the Allies, led by Britain, held diplomatic meetings in London. They were trying to broker an armistice. Ataturk wasn't having it. The Greeks are increasingly demoralized, divided. In April, Meletios writes to Venizelos. He says, "It is certain that all of us here and in Smyrna and in Athens are struggling in the dark and hitting out at friends and enemies without any definite aim anymore." It's a despairing situation. It's becoming increasingly clear that even though we haven't gotten to Lausanne, it's become increasingly clear that deportations are definitely on the table and the Patriarchate might lose its population in Asia Minor. In the weeks leading up to the Tomos on the diaspora, to make matters just worse, right? The Soviet government, which for its part was busy persecuting the Russian Orthodox Church, sent large sums of money to aid Turkey. The Greeks began to fixate on taking Constantinople. Everyone was going for broke. This is the context in which Meletios and his synod rescinded the 1908 Tomos and established the Archdiocese of North and South America. The future of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, of Orthodoxy in not only Turkey, but in Russia and frankly everywhere else, if you look at what was going on at that time, was suddenly in doubt. The great empires that defined the Orthodox world for centuries, the Russian, Ottoman, and Habsburg, were suddenly gone, and in their place was uncertainty at best, and in many cases, persecution and destruction. In this context, Meletios, who was perhaps the most creative, ambitious, and politically minded patriarch in history, dramatically reinvented the very institution of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, recasting its purpose as the master of an expansive barbarian lands that covered the majority of the globe. At the beginning of this paper, I quoted the future Patriarch Christophoros of Alexandria, who claimed that the Ecumenical Patriarchate began to extend its jurisdiction over the diaspora only in 1922, that is, with the 1922 Tomos. Although we can trace the Patriarchate's claim to the diaspora back a little further to 1908, Christophoros appears to be generally correct. The barbarian lands theory does appear to date to the early 20th century. First clearly elucidated in the 1908 Tomos and not asserted with any practical effect until 1922. One final postscript. Patriarch Meletios is the father of the modern barbarian lands theory, but within a few years, he repudiated that theory. He was forced out of Constantinople by the Turks in 1924, and in 1926, he was elected Patriarch of Alexandria, upon which his enthronement, he declared that Alexandria was now the Ecumenical Patriarchate. The next year, he deposed a priest in Morocco, which in ancient times had been under Rome, and this priest appealed to the Ecumenical Patriarchate, who claimed jurisdiction over Morocco, which at this point would be considered diaspora. Meletios responded by claiming all of Africa for Alexandria, although up to this point, at this moment, his title only covered Alexandria, Libya, Pentapolis, Ethiopia, and all Egypt. It's here in 1927, in defiance of the barbarian lands theory, that Alexandria's claim to all Africa begins, with Meletios, right, the father of the barbarian lands theory. The Ecumenical Patriarchate didn't accept this all Africa claim until 2001. I am certainly open to being proven wrong about all of this. I am not a canonist. I am not a Byzantine historian. Perhaps Balsamon and Zanaris simply ignored the barbarian lands theory when they expounded upon Canon 28. It's possible, I suppose, that St. Nicodemus at the turn of the 19th century also overlooked the theory. And perhaps the Ecumenical Patriarchate did object to Russian jurisdiction in America in some as yet undiscovered document. This is possible. But the simplest explanation, the explanation that is supported by the evidence that we do have, is that the barbarian lands theory of Canon 28 has its origins at the turn of the 20th century when a sizable Greek diaspora emerged around the world, and then soon thereafter, the Ecumenical Patriarchate under Meletios Metaxakis had to reinvent itself in the face of a once in 500 years threat to its very existence. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. So let's take 10 minutes for questions, and we got to really wrap up because we've got to get to our next stop for dinner. So Father Costi, George, and then Father Patrick. Yeah, I'm going to take off. You can come up.
Thank you very much. Very clear historical presentation. Since you're not experts in canon law, if you can please help us to understand. So the original canon states that the Patriarchate has jurisdiction over missions to barbarian land that are neighboring areas that are under different jurisdiction. Is that what it is?
It literally says only the metropolitans, so it's about ordination, only the metropolitans of the Pontian, Asian, and Thracian dioceses, as well as the bishops of the aforementioned dioceses among barbarians, are ordained by Constantinople. So it's bishops of, the text of it says, bishops of the aforementioned dioceses, so bishops of Pontus, Asia, and Thrace, who are among barbarians.
But who else could claim jurisdiction there? Isn't it all an area covered by the Ecumenical Patriarchate to begin with?
I think George might know the answer, and Father Patrick definitely would too.
The issue is these canons only imagine and only adjudicate boundaries, diocesan boundaries, jurisdictions within the existing empire, right? They know that there are Christians in Persia, They know that there are Christians south of Roman Egypt.
Well, if I could just
They never legislate about those jurisdictions, right? So
in the diocese so there were barbarians neighboring the diocese of Oriens. Okay, they were under Antioch. The barbarians of neighboring Egypt were under Alexandria. That predates even the creation of Constantinople as a patriarchate, as we would now call it. So what's happening with Canon 28 is Constantinople is being put on par with the other patriarchates, even though it's not, up to that point, hasn't been one.
Well, and if I can add,
Yeah.
you have massive population migration coming into the empire, and cities, bishops have been displaced. And so the question is, who, like in Thrace especially, that's where they're all coming through, right? And so the question is, who has the right to ordain bishops among populations that are no longer Roman but were once Roman territory?
Can I also add, according to Cyril Havaroun, who has an amazing paper on Canon 28, so Havaroun writes that Canon 28 about this privilege about ordination is actually a limitation. So like in Alexandria, the patriarch, that we now call patriarch, had the right to ordain all of the bishops. Whereas here in Constantinople, they're saying, no, you can ordain the metropolitans and they only. It specifically says, like, only these guys, only these metropolitans and the bishops of these three dioceses that are among the barbarians. So it's a limitation. It's you don't get to do what Alexandria does, for example. You only get to do this. Does that make sense?
Yes, but isn't it in the spirit of the original canon? Wouldn't be in the spirit of that if Alexandria already holds most of northern Africa, then, the regions adjacent to that should come under Alexandria.
It's very pragmatic, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a very pragmatic. Canon 28 is a very pragmatic canon. It even contains its own logic within it.
Okay. Other questions? And don't forget, we have Father Bogdan on the screen. So
I think I was third in order.
to ask a question.
I think George is next.
The second one, and then there was
Yeah. Okay. George. Yeah. And just so you know, Jim had to catch a train because he has to be in New York.
Yeah.
And so that's why all of a sudden I stepped into the role.
So let me begin by, that was excellent, right? Really excellent. That is precisely the kind of work that we need, right? It was just really, really good.
Thank you very much.
I mean, I wanted to make the point about, the imagination of barbarians at the time of the writing of the canon has to do with migration into the empire, right? That's what they're worried about. That said, right, and whereas I'm always interested in the historical work, right, you like pastorally and pragmatically speaking, I like the way you ended your paper, right? They are facing a genuine existential threat, right? And it's not, I don't see it so much, given the context that you lay out so perfectly, I don't see it necessarily so much as it's a kind of land grab, for lack of a better word, for people leaving Greece and going to America, and we're going to grab all the Hellenes we can. I see it as all the Greeks, all the Orthodox in Turkey are about to be deported all over the world. And how is the Ecumenical Patriarchate going to maintain any kind of significance, right? In other words, it's a way, it could be read as a way to sort of to advance a theory of maintaining jurisdiction over people that are about to depart.
Yeah, but it's much more expansive than that. It specifically says like any Orthodox jurisdiction that exists in America of anybody, right? So it's I think that definitely the depopulation of the Patriarchate's traditional territory it's an existential threat. I mean, and more is to come. Yeah, Father Patrick.
Okay, so I'd like to add another postscript to your presentation. I'll
let Pat, just going to ask you to keep it brief because it's 5:30.
Okay. June 1923, there is the calling of the Pan-Orthodox Congress. Contrary to popular myth, it actually involves most of the autocephalous churches, with the exception of the ancient patriarchates of Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria. But all of the others are there. And at the end of the Pan-Orthodox Congress, consistent with the Tomos of 1920, completely consistent, Meletius makes the proposal that all of the churches, all the hierarchs that are resident in America or would be resident in America would form a synod, and they would retain their hierarchical authority over each of their ethnic groups, and that the synod would be headed by a rotating hierarch. The first one would be a Slav, because he feels that this would be a popular move, given that he feels that there are lots of Slavs, and it would be unifying. The second time around, it would be a Greek speaker.
Just to add to that, Meletius also, right around this time, proposes that the Synod of the Ecumenical Patriarchate become not Greek. Yeah. And be a multi-ethnic synod. So he is very imaginative.
So he is shut down in this proposal by Gavrilo Dozic of Montenegro at that time, and later Patriarch of Serbia after the war. And he shuts him down, and he says that he expected support from Gavrilo, but Gavrilo states that that there is no authorization on the part of anyone that's attending this Pan-Orthodox Congress to discuss this issue. And despite Meletius's repeated attempts to continue to discuss it, it is completely taken off the discussion.
And I'm going to say that's a good place to stop. I want to thank Matthew, Father Bogdan, and in absentia, Father Oliver, for their great presentations. That ends our conference. It's been a rich 2 days, and yes, it's time to eat again soon. Just so you know, two things. One, if you need to, I don't know if you've been back there, if you need to use a restroom, they're out of order here. There was a water problem in the building all of a sudden, so the administration building, after you go, or there are restrooms in the chapel, which is a bit closer. So I'll just remind you of that. Well, that's further away. Those are further away. But yeah, and for those, again, sorry to exclude the non-paper presenters in this, but for those of us who presented this 2 days, as you know, we have dinner planned at Seasons 52. I would recommend, if there's somebody here that needs a ride, to get in a car, and those kinds of things. And our reservation, and we can leave independently, our reservation there is at 6:30 for our group. It's under my name, so if you get there before I do, you just tell them it's under Tony Brame, and then secondly, it's just about 10 minutes away. Where basically, if you know the Chestnut Hill Mall, it's across Route 9 from there. So, but again, if somebody needs a ride, let me know. We've got some cars, but there are some people going to meet us there, etc. So, again, I want to say thank you all. Father Bogdan, thank you so much for your presentations. Wish you well, and say hi to Father, all the brothers up in Canada.